At last count, I believe there are around 100 toddlers and their parents downstairs right now celebrating Tot Shabbat. And so I took the opportunity to write something a little serious. And so despite how it may actually initially appear, my Devar Torah tonight is not actually about Taylor Swift. There is a famous chart called the Billboard 200, which, since its creation in 1945, has tracked album sales throughout the United States of America. And for years, if you'd looked at it, you would have seen that the Beatles were the most popular artist with the longest staying power in the country. They had set the undisputed record for the most consecutive weeks in the top 10 of music sales, which means that for every week they were continuing to sell music, sell records, sell CDs, sell MP3s. They were in the top 10 consecutively for 382 weeks, which is roughly 7.5 consecutive years. And this week, Taylor Swift dethroned them and broke the record. I don't think that this should surprise anyone. You cannot, after all, escape Taylor Swift. She is, in fact, right now more than a person in many ways. She is a leading figure in the zeitgeist, the mood, the spirit, the soundtrack of our time. She's the motivating energy of our crowd. And if you know a young person, and I will say right now that part of her power is that the young person can be anywhere from someone in their mid-40s to someone who is not yet in their early teens, then you know someone who has considered seriously going to see her tour. A tour, by the way, which when it comes to Toronto this November, will cost you currently, at minimum, $2,600 for a ticket with an obstructed view. And they are in short supply. And it is that communal group energy, that kind of crowd mind thinking, which everyone is aware of in this room. We have all experienced it in some way. Even if you aren't going to the concert, it's not a new phenomenon. Today, it's Taylor Swift. In the living past, it was the Beatles. In the future, it will be someone else. And as I told you, I'm not really talking about Taylor Swift and her relatively benign influence tonight. I'm talking about the power of the crowd. An energy, a will, a pull that is so incredibly forceful, it can bring people who have little to nothing else in common together in an emotional, passionate, consuming, unified response. And above all else, it has the ability to make something appear reasonable and sensible. Because after all, everyone is doing this right now. But as creative and unifying as such an experience can be, there is also a huge danger in it. There is a massive danger in the power of the crowd, and it is on full display in this week's Torah portion, Ki Tisa, where once again we relive our nation's greatest shame, which is that at the foot of Mount Sinai, while Moses is retrieving a Torah literally written by the hand of God, the Israelites who escaped from Egypt, who lived through the Exodus, who have seen the wonders and seen the miracles with their own two eyes, they decide this week that it's time to build themselves an idol, a golden calf. And despite the best efforts of Aaron to dissuade them, and having just received very clear instruction just a few weeks ago that this thing is a full-on moral failure, the Israelites demand that they do it anyways. In our Torah portion this week, the group mind is so strong that it makes a great many people think that the most unfaithful, the most foolish imaginable choice is normal, logical, reasonable, sensible. It allows them, in fact, to ignore their very reality, a reality that they themselves lived through, because upon seeing the calf, they declare, "This is your God. This is God, O Israel. This is the God that took us out of Egypt." How could they have forgotten? How could they forget what they saw at Sinai? How could they forget Egypt? How could they embrace something they know will destroy them? How could they change their morality so fundamentally as to make this decision okay? And the answer is because the will of the crowd and its ability to make the reality it wants is very, very strong. I want you to think back to October 17th, when the Hamas-run media outlets in Gaza and the Hamas-run health ministry declared that hundreds, perhaps even thousands of people had been killed in an Israeli airstrike on Al-Ali Hospital. The claim was shared widely, reported by credible news outlets, and everyone said the only reasonable, the only sensible thing to do right now is to condemn Israel for war crimes. And it was entirely made up. It was entirely false. Credible evidence made it clear that this was not an airstrike. It was a misfired rocket, fired by Palestinian terrorists. The hospital had never been hit. It was a parking lot. And the death toll was not in the hundreds, it was not in the thousands, it was actually unconfirmed entirely. But there was a crowd that needed that first case, Hamas's case, to be true. They needed it for their morality to be secure. And by the time that the actual truth was reported, the few news outlets who did run a retraction ran it so quietly that there was no fanfare. And I would encourage you to go try to find it on CNN and CBC Today. I tried this afternoon, and a quick search function did not bring up the attack at all anymore, let alone a retraction. And we are here again this week in this exact same situation. If you turned on the news this morning, you would have seen a headline that said, "An IDF attack has killed more than 100 Palestinians seeking aid." It describes a scene where innocent people are run over by trucks trying to escape gunfire, where soldiers shoot live rounds into needy people who have just come to get food, who they in turn stampede and kill more in their haste to get away. And there is once again a crowd who is desperate for this to be true, because their morality needs it to be true. This, says the crowd, is what happened. Reasonable, sensible people will stand with us. And they really don't want to remember the last time that they tried to will this broken reality into being. But we do. This week, it is an undisputed fact that humanitarian aid trucks entered Gaza and were immediately swarmed by thousands of Gazans in need of aid. And the need for aid is indeed dire in Gaza, and it is dire because of Hamas. Because Hamas steals all of the supplies that come into the strips in order to feed their fighters and to protect their supporters. And regarding the disastrous, deadly crowd, yes, the IDF agrees, yes, there was in fact a stampede. Yes, there was a firefight. But they were actually two separate incidents at two separate locations, two separate interactions. They are two separate tragedies that have been conflated into a single uninterrupted event by Hamas, and through Hamas out into the media and into the crowd. And so what I'm sharing next is the account taken from the IDF and is supported by video footage and by drone footage. And you can look it up and you can watch it yourself after Shabbat. In the first incident, there are thousands of Gazans mobbing an early morning aid convoy that is accompanied by IDF tanks. And many people were killed. And hundreds more were hurt and crushed by each other and by the trucks and by the cars that they are indeed trying to loot. And you can see the drones capture this in real time as the IDF fires warning shots into the air and tries to break up a mob. And you can see the trucks who are driven by Palestinian contractors who drive away from the maddened push of the crowd and the sound of gunfire, and they run people over. And it is terrible. It is awful. It is horrific. It is a brutal reminder of how tragic this war is. And it is one more terrible example of how miserable it is to be in Gaza right now, where Hamas gleefully uses every moment of suffering as a tool of oppression against its own citizens and as ammunition against Israel. And to make matters worse, it feels futile, because the few trucks that managed to get away from the push of the crowd then arrived at their destination and were immediately ambushed by armed terrorists and looted all the same, just like their previously unguarded predecessors. And that is the first incident. And the second incident, the IDF clearly reports that later, after all of these supplies have been looted, a small group of Palestinians starts to approach an IDF tank, not an aid truck. And once again, just as they did earlier, the IDF fires warning shots. And once again, this group refuses to disperse and continues to advance. And this is what they say crosses the line of engagement, because sappers will regularly approach tanks to attach explosives to them, to kill the people inside. And that means that when civilians approach a tank and will not go away after being warned off, the soldiers are indeed ordered to fire. And they killed those 10 people. And that is awful. And it is tragic. But it is also at the feet of Hamas and these Palestinian terrorists who have eroded the rule of war for decades, who have created a reality repeatedly where when a group of civilians approaches a tank, the soldiers need to be trained to treat them as a threat, rather than to treat them as people in need to preserve their own lives. And all of the things I've told you today, which once again have video evidence, is not what the crowd sees. It is not what the crowd has decided happened. The crowd has decided that this was a massacre perpetrated by the IDF. And in this case, the crowd is the president of the EU and the president of France. And the crowd is a group of South American presidents and the foreign minister of Germany. And the crowd is the same shameful representatives of South Africa that brought their sham genocide case to The Hague. And the crowd is no doubt assembling in the streets of Toronto. And the crowd, of course, includes Hamas. And if one believes that the goal of this war is the genocide of the Palestinian people, rather than freeing the remaining Israeli hostages or dismantling a terrorist organization that openly expresses genocidal intent, then the story Hamas is sharing about the aid convoy works out quite well. Because if you believe that, you'll understand that only an evil, genocidal regime would stock a convoy with aid, employ drivers, guard it with soldiers and tanks so that they could lure out civilians. Only a genocidal force dedicated to ethnic cleansing would allow aid from critical nations and organizations into its borders, and then screen it multiple times at multiple checkpoints and bring it to people for whom it is meant for, and then decide to fire indiscriminately into a crowd. And only truly evil people would risk the lives of their own soldiers in enemy territory to deliver real, fully accessible containers of international aid to a population that it means to massacre in the next minute. So if you've bought into that lie, if that's the logic that you're following along with, then yes, I suppose Hamas's version of this tragedy makes perfect logical sense. One could call it reasonable. One could call it sensible. In fact, it makes about as much sense as building a golden calf. I don't know enough Taylor Swift lyrics to have a pithy ending for this evening. But I do know that despite what many voices in the world want to believe about Israel and the Jewish people, that we are not a genocidal nation, and we are not an evil people, that we are fighting a war, and it is a terrible war. It is ugly, and it is brutal, and we did not want it. What we want is our people back. And what we want is safety, not only for us, for the people who will live with us. And we are not going to let the voices of the crowd shout us down and twist who we are, no matter how loud they get or how much they insist, because we know who we are and we know what we stand for. Shabbat Shalom.